Hello and welcome to the Strategy Supper Club. This video is all about learning and hacking the 4C's. The 4C's is one of the granddaddies of strategy frameworks, and it's one that I have personally been using for like decades now. So we ran a class on this a few times. You're going to see a recording of one of those classes, and you're also going to see a recording of a bunch of the Q&A that happened on all four of the classes. So hopefully you learn a lot. And if you have any questions, of course, you can always hit me up on Twitter. I love to chat about this stuff. The 4C's. The 4C's is a framework that I consider to be like the OG of strategy frameworks. And I'm not even kidding that Eric Bruno, who's on this call, was one of the main people that taught me this when I was a baby planner at FCB New York. God knows how many years ago. And the 4C's is a framework that I have used consistently throughout my career. I have used it at just about every agency that I've worked at. I have taught the 4C's, I don't know how many hundreds of times. And it's a framework that I really believe in, but it's also a framework that has its limitations. So what I want to share today is how I've started to hack the 4C's in the last year or so. So what I first want to do in this is I just want to make sure that we're all grounded in the classic way of using the 4C's so that the hack makes a little bit more sense. So when we look at the 4C's, the C's that we're referring to are the client, and sometimes we call this the brand, or sometimes we call this the company. We are then talking also about the consumer or our audience or our target market, whatever you want to call that. We're talking about culture at large. And we're also then the fourth C is the category, or sometimes we call that the competition. And you'll hear me using those words interchangeably as we talk through this today. So whenever we use the 4C's, there's a few steps that we classically go through. The first step is one, to investigate each quadrant. And these investigations can take so many different forms. It's qualitative research, quantitative research, interviews, data mining, audits, scans. You're just basically gathering in as much data and insight as you can. Now, the kind of data and insight that you're bringing in, it really depends on a couple different factors, how you design your investigation. Really, it comes down to the amount of time you have, the speed you have, and really what the client culture is and the type of information that the client values and that they will take in and listen to. There are some agencies that have like their proprietary way of investigating the 4C's. I've never actually done that because I actually think it's more important to serve the client and morph to their culture than forcing an agency culture down their throats during this process. But hey, everybody has their way of doing it. I like to keep it a little more client-centric as opposed to agency-centric. So you go through the investigation, you get a ton of information sorted around you. And then what the next step in the 4C's, is identifying a key insight for each quadrant. And that's when you're taking this whole big mess of information and thinking and ideas that you've generated through the investigative phase, and you're boiling it down, ideally to a statement that is, maximum 8 words. That is something that really distills your thinking and is an easy handle for people to hold on to remember what you want them to remember about that quadrant moving forward. So then once you have your investigation done and you have your smart insight identified, then the magic starts to happen. And this is where we take these insights and we start to weave them into a story about where the brand should be behaving and talking about, and also perhaps what a company should be doing in the world. And once we have that woven into a story, that story then culminates into a singular statement that we either call, say, a one true thing or a brand purpose. Now, it's not that we always use the phrase one true thing, but what the differentiation I'm trying to make here is that sometimes this investigation isn't in service of an engagement initiative. So whether that's an advertising campaign or an event or something like that. So a lot of times we'll call that a one true thing. But the other thing that you can use using this investigative framework is actually setting the purpose of an entire company. And that's pretty agnostic of specific execution, but it's really being the guiding light as to what a company should stand for and where it should go moving forward. And that's one of the reasons I really love the 4C's framework, because it can work on something as granular as, say, like selling a brand of toothpaste,
which might be like a pretty granular assignment, all the way up to shifting the direction of a big mega corporation. And that's why I think this framework has endured over time, because it can flex up and down so beautifully. So what we're going to do now really quickly is I'm going to just show how a 4C's has been classically used using a classic output example that has come out recently. Now, I did not work on this campaign, but I think this is a really good example of how strategy translates into execution. So that's why I'm using it as an example. The example is a recent spot that came out about a month or so ago for Harley Davidson. The spot was done by Droga 5. And I put this in your notes as homework because we've been just having a little bit of issues with streaming this, with it coming through smoothly. But essentially what happens in this spot is you see a motorcyclist and the camera's basically at motorcyclist view. And there's a voice of a woman. It's kind of mechanical. It feels slightly digitized. And she's saying things like, keep scrolling, don't go outside, don't leave your desk. And it's just this really like almost 1984-esque voiceover as you're watching a motorcycle zoom through a cityscape. And then in the last 15 seconds or so, the motorcycle like bursts out into a country landscape. And the voiceover changes to just breathe, just breathe. I think it says the word live. And then you get to the end card. And the reason I chose this spot, and if you haven't watched it yet and you go back and watch it, you can really see the 4C's in this spot. In fact, it almost seems like some of the language from the brief was lifted into the copywriting, because it is quite transparent in addressing, especially the cultural 4C and the answer that Harley is trying to provide. So that's why I chose this. So let's go through so what I'm doing now is I'm backing the strategy out of the execution. And so this is all just a guess. I don't know if this actually was the 4C, but I think we're going to get pretty close with this guess. So we're going to start with the category of this, the category of the competition. Now, the interesting thing about this spot is that it's lifting the category versus trying to overtly compete with the category. So most of the time, I would say probably about 80% of the time when we do a 4C's exploration, we are looking for the white space in the category. We are looking for what the competition is doing wrong and how our brand can offer something better than the competition to the audience that we're trying to serve. The reason that I think that this spot is really serving the category is that since 2008, the motorcycling category as a whole has been just declining like crazy. And Harley's business, because Harley is by and large the leader in the industry, their business has just been falling off a cliff. Younger people just aren't taking up motorcycling the way that older generations did. And so what I'm seeing in the spot and what Harley's trying to do, I think, is actually not trying to say like, oh, Harley's better than Triumph or Harley's better than Ducati. What Harley's actually trying to do is say motorcycling is amazing. And so when we have a situation like this, where the market leader is trying to lift the entire category, when we look at the category C, we're actually not looking for the hole in the category. We're looking for what benefit that category can have for people. And so that's where I got to this idea of unadulterated living. And what that comes from is actually the experience of riding a motorcycle. I've spent a little bit of time, well, I spent a lot of time on motorcycles. And one of the great things about being on a motorcycle is that you really are just living in the moment. You have to be in total flow when you're on a motorcycle. You can't scroll through anything. You can't look at a screen. You can't really focus on much else than what you're doing. And so there's this real Zen-like sense of presence when you're on a motorcycle. But then also on top of that, everything is heightened. Like anything that's going on in the weather, you're going to feel to an extra degree. You're going to smell roadkill. You're going to see the landscape in a different way. And when you're on a motorcycle, there really is this acute sense of being alive. And it's one of the few things that I actually do in my life, and a lot of other motorcyclists will say that they do in their life, where they feel like they are just truly and purely living. And that's why a lot of motorcyclists are so addicted to the sport. So I wanted to represent that in the category C and say that motorcycling is really all about unadulterated living, which goes against a tension in the cultural C. And this is the tension that is so vividly brought to life in this spot, in that in comparison to just that feeling alive when you're motorcycling, the world, especially when we're so locked in by screens the way we have been, especially in the last 10 years or so, just starts to feel a bit numbed out. All the scrolling, all the like auto this, auto that, it just starts to feel like the edges of our emotions are kind of numbed out a bit. And so the cultural C I have here is really one of the main tension points in this 4C's exercise of there's this numbed out world. Now, Harley in all of this is the leader of the pack when you think about the motorcycling category. And so, like I was talking about before, because they have a right, and they do this in the spot of just taking on the role of advocating for the industry and really being a strong advocate for this idea of just living, right? But also what Harley needs to understand in this 4C's exercise is that they're also the leader of the decline. Actually, other motorcycling brands have been gaining volume and their business has been going up. But the reason that the whole market is depressed is because the leader, Harley, for the last 20 years or so, or even longer, has been presenting an idea of motorcycling that is increasingly outdated. They've continued to cater to an older market that a younger market doesn't find very welcoming or find very aspirational. And that sense of not being super welcoming also extends into their brand experience. Like when you walk into a dealership, like I've been in a ton of dealerships, and once you get through the door, they're really nice, but on the front, they're a bit intimidating when you first like step in. So in this 4C's exercise, if I was working with this client, I'd say, yeah, you absolutely have a right to advocate for motorcycling. You should. It's your job if you want to change this around. But you also have to recognize where you in your own actions have kind of messed it up as well. And then finally, going to the consumer C, what I've put here is this idea of somebody who is desperately desiring depth. This is somebody who really wants to go out and live. They really want to do things like, they're probably drawn to things like rock climbing, tough mudders, skydiving. These are people that are always trying to push the edge of life and push the edge of their existence. And they are frustrated by the numbed out world that they're living in and are looking for vehicles through which to exercise this kind of heightened sense of living. So that's my guess of roughly what the 4C's might be for this spot. And I culminated it in a one true thing because it is a campaign. It's not an overall brand. It's not a brand purpose, but it's a one true thing. Into Harley is an invitation to live. Let me explain why I chose that really quickly. On the one hand, this idea of living, we've been talking about it through this entire discussion around, the category is all about living. This idea of heightened living is really in contrast to the numbed out world. And so living to me would be something that would really be exhibited in what the brand says. But I think the idea of invitation is really important because invitation should drive what the brand does in this moment. Like I talked about before, Harley's been a brand that's kind of not been super welcoming. They've kind of put a wall up around themselves and built a cult-like following that is a bit brusque. And I'm a big believer that if Harley is going to succeed in its next era, not only does it have to advocate for the category, it in itself as a brand and as a brand experience has to make itself more inviting to a younger audience. So that's why I think this idea of invitation is really important. Invitation doesn't appear in the spot at all, but as like a rabid motorcyclist, I just kind of have to put it in there because I would love for Harley to be more inviting. So that's my rough look at the 4C's and an example of how it might come to life. Now let's talk about the hack. So there is something that I think is fundamentally flawed in the 4C's when we're trying to get to brand stories. And it's step 3. I even said it when I was talking about step 3 before, like this is where the magic happens. We magically weave it into a story. And I think the issue with the 4C's in this step is that the 4C's as a construct, as the way it is illustrated, does not inherently lend itself to good storytelling. It does not trigger a planner to think about the things you need to think about when you are building a brand story. So whereas if you are trained up in 4C's or you are a very senior brand strategist that has done the 4C's a lot, you know inherently what parts of the story that you should be looking for when you're building the 4C's. But if you're younger or you don't have as much experience, it might be a little bit harder to extract the story out of the 4C's if you're not thinking about a different step. And so what I'm trying to do here is illustrate a slightly different construct that forces all of us to remember that ultimately we are building a story. And stories have certain elements that if we represent them in the form and on the page, we can actually get to a much stronger brand story much faster. So it starts with the premise that great brand stories and great stories in general come from taking on tensions. If you think about any book you've ever read, any movie you've ever seen, the plot really gets going when something goes wrong, when a tension is introduced. And that tension grabs our own attention, and it gives the protagonist in the story something to work towards and work through. And so what I think is absolutely necessary when we're working on our brands and building the stories for them is identifying the tension, because that's what's going to make these brands great. So the 4C's framework, some 4 nicely overlapping circles that are very, kind looking almost. It's just not inherently built to find tensions. There's no place in that framework where it inherently says, hey, make sure you're identifying your tension. So these days I've started using a different framework to get to the story. And this framework is really inspired by superhero constructs, using the most basic story framework that we all understand. And we've all known the story ever since we were little kids. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there were villagers that were threatened by a dragon, and a hero came in, fought the dragon, and saved the day. And really, it's boiling down a brand story into 3 distinct forces and using attention space to really give the brand a place to be the hero. So let's walk through how this works. So you have the hero, and in our case, the hero is the client. And like any good brand strategist, as we're going through our investigation and learning about our clients or the brand or the product that we're working for, we should think about the characteristics, its strengths, its unique superpowers. In this construct, we think about it as the hero. And also in thinking through that hero, we also have to be honest about the deficiencies or outright weaknesses of that brand or hero, because every hero also has an Achilles heel most of the time. So this is where we get really honest about, this is who the hero is. This is what they're really great at. This is what they're not so great at. So therefore they should focus on what they're really good at and exploit that in the world. The next force in this construct are what I call people. I actually really hate using the word consumer. I only used it earlier to keep the 4C's clean. So we're going to switch the language over to people just now. And the people are the people that the hero are really obsessed with serving. They want to make sure that they are living in a world where they can thrive, where they don't have tensions, where things aren't annoying them or attacking them. Ultimately, the hero wants to do right by the people. And the things that can potentially cause friction and tension for the people are either things that are happening at the world at large, which is culture, or in the case of a brand construct, things that are happening in the category where they're not being served. And so that world that we think about, like once upon a time in a world far, far away, we talk about this world and we talk about what's going on in the world. That's where we put our thinking around culture and the category and finding the ways that that world aren't serving the people. Okay. So here's the juicy part, and here's where our job as brand strategists gets good, and we like really do well delivering our job, is that our job is to find the tension between either people and culture and or people and the category. Because if you think about it, like we talked about before, every great story has tension. Every great story has a dragon, an enemy, a bad guy. And this is the thing that gives the hero a real reason to exist in people's lives. So it's really ugly the way I drew it, but what I'm ultimately proposing in this diagram is that we actually draw tension lines that give us a space to overtly identify the tensions that our audiences are experiencing with the world at large. And once we identify that tension, and if we're really honest about the tension and really honest about our hero, then our hero has a really strong role to play in that the hero serves these people by either alleviating or eliminating the tension that they're feeling. And if we can help companies see that, one, we've done our job really well, but two, we're setting up our clients to have a relevant, juicy, real role in people's lives. So the reason that I like this janky ass ugly model, and if anyone wants to redesign it for me, that's fine. I'm in quarantine. I'm not worried about design so much right now. And there's a few reasons why I really like this model. One is that it overtly creates that space to acknowledge tension. There is a line on the diagram that says, hey, anyone, hey, strategist, hey, client, this is really important. And it's super important that we identify it and acknowledge it and deal with it. The second thing I really like about doing the construct this way is that we're not defining audiences by their frustrations. More often than not, when I'm working on a 4C's in the classic construct, and I did this in the Harley example, in order to build the tension in there, because I, as a brand strategist, as many brand strategists know, we have to have tension in the story. A lot of times that tension gets built into the way that we think about the audience. And we start to think about the audience as their deficits and the things that frustrate them, as opposed to thinking about the audience as just people who aren't being served in a certain way. And I just think it's much nicer and it's much more empowering to think about our audiences as people versus people who are flawed, people that are frustrated, people that aren't being served. It's just a more empowering way to think about somebody. If you think about it in your own life, do you want people to look at you and the first thing they think about is the way that you're frustrated or the way that you're flawed? Like, we would never do that towards somebody that we respect or that we love. And yet a lot of times the 4C's construct, because we're so, we really understand that we need to get tension in there, we map it into the audience. And so what I like about this construct is that we're not mapping it into the audience. We're actually letting the audience be who they are and giving the tension another place to live. And in the end, the third thing I really like about this construct is that it forces the audiences to be very important. Ultimately, the audience not only isn't defined by what they're frustrated about, but they're also the most important thing in the story. They're the thing that the hero is serving. And in working with some clients that I've worked with, where they get so obsessed with like their own company, their own product, and they think build it and they will come. And they start to forget how important it is to listen to their audiences and serve their audiences. This construct on point 4, building points 3 and 4 together, is really honest about what brands should exist to do. You are there to serve people. And the instant that you forget that you are there to serve people, your business and your brand will suffer. So just by the way that this construct is built, it really forces the service versus the people relationship that I think brands absolutely have to adhere to, especially in this day and age. So do I think that the 4C's is still valuable? Absolutely. I still love the 4C's. I still use it on every single project that I work on. But the 4C's to me is valuable as an investigative framework. It's the reminder to be very thorough and make sure that I'm addressing a client's problem from every single angle, and I'm investigating everything I should investigate. And yeah, I drew these ugly scribble lines there. The other thing that the 4C's construct also forces us to do in our investigation is be really aware of where the overlap is between the C's and understand where that overlap is really smooth and lovely, but also where that overlap might be starting to cause some tension and some banging against each other. So I still think the 4C's is super valuable. I use it almost every day that I'm working. So let's just do a quick recap before we open it up for discussion. 1, great brand stories and moments come from taking on tensions. That's how we give our brands a really strong role to play. And it's how brands, quite frankly, get to be quite interesting in the world. The 4C's framework, just by looking at it, it's just not inherently built to find these tensions. It doesn't mean it's not valuable, but it doesn't really mark the space where we should find the tensions in our brands. So the storytelling model uses the exact same elements. And that's another thing I love about the storytelling model. It works. It's a beautiful step 2 from the 4C's framework being step 1. You do your investigation, you do your whole digging into the different quadrants, and then you use all that information and just move it into a slightly different configuration to make sure that the tensions are amplified and that the story making process is so simplified. So that's what I have for provocation. I would love to open it up to the group. And if you just unmute I can call on you, or if it's quiet, just start to talk. It's fine. So does anyone have any questions or comments or even like rebuttal of what I just put out? I'd love to hear anything.
I always love trying to articulate the role that the brand plays.
Right.
I love it when you talk about resolving attention.
Right. So here, if you look at the Harley example, let me make this a little bit bigger so people can see it. You have the people on the one hand, instead of desperately seeking depth, you just acknowledge that they're like depth junkies. These are people that like really want to go out and live life, right? But the tension that they're experiencing is that culture is pretty numbed out, and they're probably feeling pretty numbed out by culture. And so the tension is that they're looking for that intensity feeling, that life, but they're just not getting it from the world around them at large. So Harley can come in and be the advocate for the category because it is the leader, right? And really say like, no, there's a space over here. There's a product, there's an experience that is going to give you that sense of life, that unadulterated living that you're hungry for. And in that, inviting people to come in and quote unquote live with Harley. And so Harley satisfies their desire to have that kind of intensity and that feeling and that life in their own lives.
Yeah.
So that's how I see it playing out.
Yeah.
I can jump in there just to get
Josh.
things started.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, and thank you so much for going over that. I was sort of surprised when I saw the deck, but it makes a little more sense now to see the client as the hero rather than the person or the market. And when you even look at the Harley ad, if you can identify a hero in there, it's probably the person on the bike more than the bike itself. They're the ones that are breaking out into the world. And so the way that you sort of talked it over, I think it kind of all fit together in my head. But when I've tried to help people, and I've only been on the in-house side where I'm working with maybe another unit of the company that's trying to get their story straight. And as you said, it can often be very attribute driven, where it's like, oh, well, we have this thing that can do this very well or better than the other person out in the market. But what I've had success with there is just, and sorry, this is getting a little rambly, but if anyone else has young children, I've got a 6-year-old daughter, and one of her favorite things to do is listen to a podcast called The Story Pirates. And it's brilliant. If you guys have young kids, check it out. But one of the things that they talk about is the definition of a story. And that is a character in a place who has a problem. That is a story. That's kind of the foundation of all stories, as you kind of walk through in your superhero example as well. And, you know, asking people who the main character of the story is, I think really helps them, or has helped me help them orient to, we need to make this about the person that we're talking to rather than the thing that we're talking about. And I've had a lot of success that way. And I wonder, you know, if I'm alone there, or if you sort of think about it in a similar way.
Yeah, I think we are talking about it really similarly. When I first, just to build on what you started with in your comment, when I first started using this construct, there was confusion with people that I was working with about like, but wait, I thought the audience was supposed to be the most important thing. You're making the brand the hero. And I thought that was really good feedback for me to hear. And it sounds like you kind of went through the same mental jig in that. And that's why I really started thinking more about the hero, and I'm more overt about defining the hero as somebody who serves versus somebody who's the center of attention, right? Now, I know a lot of times in these stories, it is the hero that we're following their quest and all that thing. But really what I'm trying to show here is that the hero does it because they're trying to help somebody else, right? And ultimately it's to serve. Sure. And so that's why I've put a lot of language around that. And I think I need to keep thinking about how to make that even more abundantly clear when I talk this through.
Yeah. Well, I can also see that being very useful in an agency client setting too, where you probably have a client who wants to be the hero more than they want someone else to be the hero.
Yeah, definitely. And when you use the hero thing, it also I'm also really enjoy using the Jungian archetypes as well. So what it does then is it says like, you have to go out and do things in the world. Like you have to take action. And then you use the Jungian archetypes to say, and then this is the quality of the kind of hero you are. And that can take on many different characteristics. And when I use these two constructs in concert with each other, it's a very powerful thing for clients to understand, like, why they exist and how they should be interacting with people.
I feel like when I first started in strategy, we talked a lot about kind of the hero as like disruption, or creating an experience that basically stops people and they don't know what they did before basically they had this moment. But now I think when you're talking about the idea of service, we talk a lot about enablement and about how do our brands enable people to kind of see themselves in the way that they want to be seen. And that's been a helpful exercise as well, to start to, although the brand is the hero, you're still thinking about it from the perception of what that means to the end user.
I love that. That's so helpful. Thank you, Betsy. That's great.
How would you position it if you find that you go through this sort of tension and this way of crafting a story, but you find that the client is so fundamentally flawed in their product offering, for example, that they are unable to take on any kind of heroics? Yeah. So I'm just wondering if there's a kind of a way to position the narrative, which means that they have to go on some journey to becoming a hero, as opposed to identifying the good thing that they have and then, catapulting them from there. Because I think there are definitely brands and product lines that just need a total rejig before you can even consider going in that direction.
So here's what I would do. I don't know. But like, if a client kept pushing you to say, no, like, we're ready to go to market. We're fine. Do your investigation and lay out where the tension actually lives and say, you're actually not ready to do a story yet because your tension line is in the wrong place. Like, you're totally in the wrong place with the tension line right now. And hopefully by showing how they're breaking the storytelling model, that can be a tool to help them rejigger. I don't think it would be the only tool, but it's one of those situations where it's one way of illustrating that there's bigger issues that need to be fixed here before you can go to market.
No, I like that. I think if you talk about a narrative structure of being a hero and then you slap them over the wrist and say, but you can't be one yet, hopefully that's motivation enough for them to get sorted. Yeah,
I mean, and if you just show, like, the tension line's supposed to be here, but the problem is that you're not matching culture, you're not matching the people, like, the tension line's emanating out of you. We need to talk about you. Then I think that's a really good signal to be like, let's change directions, right?
Got it. Yeah, that's good.
Cool. That's a great question. It's a great one.
Yeah, so picking up on what Zoe mentioned before about this case where, the client just didn't have their strengths to even start to dig into this narrative. One of my favorite problems to solve is to, like, take a brand that's fallen and figure out what made them great at one point.
Yes.
If they've been around and they've fallen, then you can use that moment which made them great to craft where they should go in a way that's actually authentic to, like, the soul of the brand.
Absolutely. I love that point. And just to build on it, something that I do a lot in companies that are, like, wavering and they're off track and they're trying to get themselves back again, I ask either to talk to the founder or I ask for the founding story, because usually the thing that made them great is there. And I'll ask the founder, why did you start this company? Like, and I'll put them, like, in a really relaxed space. I'll put them in a room, like, where there's no technology, almost like a therapist couch, and I'll say, why did you start this company? Like, talk to me about your hopes and dreams. Talk to me about all that stuff. And you're so right. It's so often that the strength is in there.
I am obsessed with how you really focused on pivoting the audience from moving away from being defined as their pain points. It's the hardest thing. I've sat at the brand strategy seat, and my current seat is an experience strategy. So we're working on expanding the journey and mapping those pain points and prototyping against those pain points. It's such a big challenge for clients to not get focused on those pain points. I think, like, that's one of the biggest trip ups when it comes to zeroing in on the North Star of the brand. I think a lot of clients really love that, and they can take that as a badge of honor, walk it down the halls. Category and culture, the way you put them together, I think is great, because it's hard to find the line between those two. And looking right now, they've never been so much more merged. For example, I'm working on a cybersecurity client at the moment, and Business Unusual meets new normal, there's a blurring of lines there, and it's basically a hour by hour conversation working with creatives to not have them build lines or taglines or ways in that are focused on, like you said, the audience leading from the back foot. I love that, because I wrote down, like, in the lens of cybersecurity, I was writing down like safety seekers and stuff. Like, it makes you start to see people running for safety. Like they're coming from a place of fear, but I wrote down bravery. If it's about cybersecurity, it's about protection, the people holding up those shields, it takes strength in your arm to really do that. Instantly just pivots. And I think that's such an important thing for every new strategist on this call too. It's a beautiful goosebump moment when you're building that kind of framework. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, I love that. And you know what, Michael, if I can just build on what you said, because I love you offering up that, even that very discrete example is so helpful. There are two ways that I really would urge everyone not to define their audiences by. Okay. The first way is what we're talking about here. It's like when you define them purely by their pain. And it's okay, like, pain points are amazing, right? Because pain points drive incredible creation. But when they are the way that you're solely defining the target market, that's where it gets a little bit patronizing, I think. So, like, not solely defining your target by the pain. And then the second way that I really get annoyed with the way people define their target is defining them only through the lens of the category. So if you are working on a product and you imagine yourself walking up to somebody who you were trying to woo in the audience, would that person ever say to you, "Hi, my name is Heidi and I use toilet paper"? No, because we don't do our identities based on categories, hardly ever. Harley's probably the exception. So, like, one of the first 5 things I might say about myself to somebody when I'm meeting them is, "Hi, I'm Heidi and I ride a Harley." That could probably happen. But Harley is one of the very, very few brands where people, in saying, "Tell me 5 things about yourself," they will offer up their relationship to a category or their relationship to a brand. And yet so many times when I work on brand stuff and I'm working with clients, they get so obsessed with people's relationship with their product or category that they're like, "Well, this woman is a super soft toilet paper woman." And it's like, no, she's not. She's a mom who's really freaking busy, who has like all these kids. And yeah, toilet paper is probably, well, I mean, not lately, it's probably the worst example to use right now, but usually toilet paper is like a tiny little decision in her life, right? And being appropriate about the importance that our brands and our categories have with our audiences. So just to wrap up my little rant here, I'm sorry, I'm ranting a lot. To build on what Michael's saying, defining them by their pain is really frustrating, but defining them as like just a category consumer is also very limiting as well.
So I don't work a lot with products or CPG. I do a lot of services like education and healthcare and hospitality and such. And is there any nuance that you would sort of add to that type of construct? And then I guess the second part is, it seems like there's always so many people, like the audiences are just so, there, so many multiple target audiences that aren't targeted or focused. And I just wonder how you work with that.
Awesome. Those are 2 great questions. The first question is actually, no, I don't flip it around a lot when I switch between different types of clients. In fact, I've taken this construct into government. I've taken it into nonprofit. I've taken it into private sector, from startup to massive company, and it works. It keeps working. And I think because it is such a fundamental framework that is so rooted in just the basic act of investigation and storytelling. Now, when you start to apply it, yes, then it's going to start to apply differently. But it's actually kind of interesting. The people I get the most resistance from are people in nonprofit, because nonprofit people think that for-profit people are dirty and that we like have like tools of the devil in our arsenal. But the way that I always get nonprofit people on board with it is, one, talking about like, yes, it's primal, like it's just who we are as humans, like this is why we do this exercise. But then the other thing, if they're still resisting, is I will say to nonprofit, like, look, I'm sorry, but Coca-Cola, Nike, and Google have spent billions of dollars training people how to take in information. and how we interact with organizations, I know the tricks. Let me help you, because right now you're not doing it very well, but like, and you don't have enough money to retrain people in a different way. Let's use the way that Coca-Cola does it. So, because people have always been trained to do that.
Mhm.
So that's always a conversation I have to have with nonprofits, and usually they'll like, okay, they'll come around. When it comes to multiple audiences, this is an excellent question. When I'm doing the brand work, I always insist with my clients that we narrow down the audience as much as possible. And so, for example, I've been doing work in fashion lately, and fashion does a really interesting thing where they have muses, and I use a muse a lot in my brand work. So when I'm doing the brand story, the bigger story, I will say, okay, we're going to pick a muse, and the muse is the person, if we think in modern KPI, this is the person, like if they posted that they loved your brand on Instagram and you didn't have to pay them to do it, you would be like thrilled. You would be so excited that that person did it, because that would be validation that like you had made it. And Nike really works off this model quite a bit, like where they will pick like the most aspirational version of a runner or of a youth basketball player. And their thinking is that if we build the brand so it's cool enough for them, other people will follow. And so when I do have multiple targets, I push a client to be like, who is just like the one that you would, it has to be cool for the coolest one, right? Mm-hmm. And then once we get the brand sorted out, then what we do is think about how to apply that brand to your different commercial segments. And that's where you actually get your volume, right? So sometimes your highest volume segment is actually not the muse, but you're just applying it so it works for them. And for me personally, a brand that is totally this is, oh, good luck, Ewan, is Glossier. So Glossier has been totally built for the 20-something woman, right? I probably have more Glossier in my makeup closet than, or whatever you want to call it, makeup bag, than any 20-year-old does, because I have the disposable income, right? And I buy Glossier like crazy. Am I their target? No, not at all. But am I a segment that like they've learned how to talk to this segment using everything that's awesome about their brand? Absolutely. And so I think like that's a really good way of showing very quickly that like we build our brands sometimes for the most aspirational, and then we apply them to our commercial segments afterwards.
Great. I was wondering, I similarly to Michael, am obsessed. One thing that strikes me, and it might be a little nitty, is trying to unpack the difference between tension and pain points. Because in my mind, Michael, your example was like when you almost take a pain point and flip it on its head, so it's reflecting back the culture or the category. That's where you get tension. But I'm just wondering if there are any like questions you ask yourself to interrogate pain points in order to get to tension. And I'm coming from a place where I think right now, just our process tends to involve a lot of like design sprinting. And to your point, I think Michael had also mentioned like prototyping for solutions. And that tends to be like a direct reflection of a particular pain. But I think that the tension is a lot more like evocative.
I hear you. I've never been asked this question before, so just bear with me as I bumble through trying to answer this question. Tensions to me, they live between the forces of the 4C's, right? And when you get to like that really crisp idea of like what you think the culture C is about, or the category C, or the people C, or whatever consumer C, it's that relationship between those forces pulling against each other or banging against each other is the tension. And then the pain point is when you're getting down to actual, say, adoption journeys or use journeys. Okay. So let me use Harley as an example. So if you had the people are, instead of being desperately seeking depth, these are people that are like depth junkies or something, you know what I mean? Like they love living life. They love experiencing things, and culture is being so numbed out. That's like the big tension that they're feeling. So let's say they go to motorcycling and they're like, this is the way I'm going to solve that like life tension that's in my life. Well, the first year of motorcycling really sucks. It's really hard. And if you don't have someone guiding you through the first year of motorcycling, there's like 1,000 pain points to get over. You have to learn how to clutch. You have to learn how to ride in rain. You have to learn how to you have to figure out your gear, right? And gear is a big thing. You have to find a mechanic that you trust. And there's a lot of people that give up motorcycling in the first year. And my hunch on that is because if you don't have someone guiding you through those pain points of that first year of motorcycling, you're going to give up because the pain points are pretty crazy. So to me, that's kind of like the difference between tension is when the 4C's are banging, right? And then once you get into product use or adoption, then there's all these other just like annoyances and things that are in your way. Those to me are pain points. But I would love to hear someone else's perspective on it because I've never been asked that question before. And I'm sure someone else has a much better answer to that.
I'll add on that. I think the tensions might also come from the inconsistencies, right? Like we can pull, if you think about a user journey, the pain points are very clear. I can't sign up and something's unclear. I don't understand the value propositions, but it's the tension between, what am I thinking versus what am I feeling, or what is the goal of why I'm using the product versus the motivation. So if you're making a photo sharing app, people might tell you, I want to share photos, but why? What is the motivation? Is it to feel more connected? Is it to flaunt your life? Like trying to understand a little bit more of the emotional versus just the functional.
I love that. Yeah. So maybe it's like tensions live at the emotional level and pain points live more at the functional level. Maybe that's a way of thinking about it. Sorry, Gregory, is that in line with what you were saying?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a functional emotional and then also just like inconsistencies where someone might say they want something, but in reality it's something different.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Much more simple than what I said. Thank you. If you can get back to that original, like the principles or the problem that they were trying to crack, then that often creates such a fertile place for new growth and inspiration for a company. So I love that you brought that up. Thank you for bringing that up.
One really, really quick answer or way that I've started to address the tension issue. Very simply, it is the from and the to. And you don't know the from and you don't know the to until the client articulates what their problem is and what a potential solution is. And so the tension is that really fine razor's edge between where you are and where you want to get to. And I know that's an oversimplification, but it starts to help clients realize what is a real tension point they can address. And what I've learned over the years specifically to this is that sometimes their tension points are internal. It's innovation, it's accounting, it's management, it's leadership. It has nothing to do with consumers or people out there. And so I think it's our job to really unpack what that, Heidi, to your point, what that therapy session is, why that therapy session is so important, is unpack what is that from, that problem they're trying to solve so that they can get to the to. And really simply, that tension point is when you are standing on the ledge of a cliff and you're ready to jump down. You know what your mission is to get in the water. But it's that moment that you have to leap is the tension. And that's where I really focus a lot of my time is what's the real tension point? And sometimes it's marketing and sometimes it's not.
I love that, Eric. I love that.
Hi. I'm just kind of seeping in, and this is great. I think it's a really unique way to look at it. And as a strategist, I've been practicing, you have, for me, when I find an insight, it's more feeling and I get it. But when I'm trying to think of tension, how would you say you would define it, or you have like a good tension?
This came up on yesterday's call, actually, because I was like, sometimes at the end of it, I'll have 20 tensions.
Right.
And it's probably like, sometimes it's bleeding into pain points, right? Like you have this list that are a ton. So, what I'm really looking for is, again, that collision between the two forces, like two of the C's, like where you just feel this really awful collision that's happening. And also a collision that's pretty terrible that the client can really solve for. Because isn't that the best, right? Like if someone's really feeling the pain of, let's go back to the Harley example, we'll just keep going back there. The pain of living in a world where everything feels kind of like soft and padded and screened up and everything. And you can offer them something that's going to make them feel more alive, and you truly can offer that to them. Then lean into that horrible tension, right? Because like you're going to be a bigger hero. The bigger the tension, the more heroic you can be, right? But sometimes I go through a process and there's still like 3 tensions at the end of the day. And at that point, I think there's just something about trusting your gut, taking a leap, trusting your experience. And, I always like to go for the scariest one. I'm always somebody that likes to push clients, like, just go for it. Like, why not? You know? So there's no science to it. I think it's a breed of experience, but do knowing what you can cut away. So cutting away pain points, cutting away things that aren't really big collisions between them, cutting away stuff that you can't solve. Right.
Yeah, and this is kind of, I think, Zoe, part and parcel to what you're talking about as well, which is, I think I still use the 4C's because it's just it's classic, and I don't have to sort of argue with new methods, or
right.
I'm not smart enough to come up with new methodologies. Like, if you spend enough time in client, to Heidi's point a minute ago, you actually are allowed to talk about their flaws as much about their potential heroism. In the consumer section or the people section, you're allowed to talk about the pain points as much as what success is. Now, I use the 4C's, and those, if you kind of divide each of those circles into a half, if you will, so you have almost a positive and a negative, but that's the tension point within each of those. I don't try to come up with the overall narrative anymore. I found that was too subjective, and too many clients, depending on their level of sophistication, either just didn't get it, or I was pretty shit at telling the story they needed to hear. So what I've done is use each of those circles as a way to help them build their own narrative. So I bring the tension points into them. And so, Zoe, to your example, that might help identify, oh, our tension actually exists within us and within culture. Let's build the narrative together. So I use it as a workshop to get to the narrative. And then it's not that I don't have a point of view, but it allows them to come along this sort of narrative journey with you. It's a little more work, and it requires a lot more sophistication on a client, right? They have to be able to come along this journey with you. But the output of it is such a more solid, strategic, and creative narrative, because you've identified where the weaknesses are along with the client, as opposed to kind of, the old school man on the mountain kind of, here's what I think they are.
That's awesome.
Problem that I fell into for many years.
I love that, Eric. I actually would love to learn more about that, and maybe have you come teach one of these classes on it, because you're going to. Sorry. You're too smart. You're going to have to do it, because I think that's like a really, I understand exactly what you're talking about. There was a long time where I was trying to build tension and insight into each C, and I was having a hard time navigating it. And that's why I ended up like trying to break down and rebuild it in this structure. But I'm also really curious about the way that you've done that as well. I think it sounds super smart.
Especially in this day and age, when I find more clients don't know their own, they're trying to rally their own troops. They in their heart know what they think they should do. And so the 4C's pivots much, much more towards an internal motivation, and different than Josh's point, an internal heroism that actually becomes this, and Heidi, you'll love this. I'm binge watching Game of Thrones finally, but it really becomes this sort of banner that they can all rally behind, versus the consumer or the people out there feels very distant, and they don't know how to use it as a motivation point. And so you almost have to find that thing, that handhold that everyone can grab onto internally, in order to get the thing moving forward, whether that's product innovation, whether that's marketing, whether that's accounting and finance. So I'm going to shut up now. I really apologize for taking so much time.
No, I think it's awesome. And I'm going to catch up with you offline, because I want to hear more about it, and maybe we can figure out another class that you're going to teach. It's going to be great.
I know nothing about brand. I know nothing about strategy. This is incredibly interesting. So my curiosity is just on fire right now. I'm curious, do you ever use this model? Like, you're working with a client, and do you ever take it down one sub where you're now working within have you had them apply that to their own team?
I really believe that an external brand and an internal team culture is two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And always, without fail, when I go work with companies, especially startups, a lot of times, this is the assignment I get over and over again. A startup will come to me about 3 to 5 years into existence. They'll say, something's not working externally with our brand. Like, it's starting to break. People aren't understanding us. We're losing market share, whatever. They'll come to us. And as I start to do the investigation, especially when I'm investigating the client C, I will start to uncover inconsistencies in their internal culture. And when people inside of a company do not understand why the company exists and what it's trying to do and how it's trying to serve people, they will start to do their own things, and then the brand will start to break, right? So what I've done in my practice over the last few years is not only create brand purposes that allow for external engagement, so therefore this is how you have to do your social strategy and blah, 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 all this stuff, but I've also started to develop the practice of how you change internal cultures, working with HR teams, with finance, with procurement, with the R&D team, because everybody has to be walking to the same beat for this to work. So yes, you can actually take this and like flip it down inside a company as opposed to just flipping it outside into the world. In fact, I would argue for a brand to be successful in this day and age, you have to.
I agree totally. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, along those lines, when you are reviewing this with a client or with a brand and revealing this one true thing or the brand purpose, and they are not either ready to accept what you've uncovered, or if it's not desirable for whatever reason, how do you navigate that kind of after the fact conversation of either it's not what they're desiring to be in the future, or there's some some tensions between who they truly are and what service they can offer and what they want to be in the market instead.
Yeah, Dan, I think you're bringing up a really good point, which is it's about client and political management of a process, right? Which a lot of times has nothing to do with the work we do as strategists, but is everything that we do. It's the work of strategists, right? So there's no neat and clean answer to this, but what I will say is that as I've gotten older and more cranky in my career, the thing that I really dislike are surprises. So when I was younger in my career and I worked at a lot of the classic agencies and freelance at a lot of the classic agencies, there was this real moment of, okay, we're going to, as a strategist especially, and as creatives, we're going to work with the client for a little bit. We're going to get some stuff. We're going to go away for 3 weeks, and then we're going to come back and we're going to just wow you with this amazing thing. And more often than not, that gets blown up, right? And it's also pretty arrogant on the part of us to think that like we have the one true answer and that's it, So what I try to do actually, I do this all the time. I have no patience for that kind of process anymore. I am much more collaborative with my clients. I'm much more co-building. I'm much more riffy with them. And what that allows is when I start to discover things that I'm like, oof, this is going to be uncomfortable for them. Like, they're not going to like this. I can start to just like chew on it with them and see how they react. And maybe get them used to the idea a little bit, or understand what their negativity is against it. And like, think about that, because they're not stupid. Like they're smart. They understand what's going on with their brands, right? So I just find overall this concept. In fact, when I had my own company, W&W, we had a mantra: no surprises. Like, our job is not to like razzle dazzle or wow our clients. Our job is to be really good partners to them and work with them every step of the way. So I would just encourage everybody to get out of that old school thinking of like, we go away, we come back 3 weeks later and we wow them, because like it just smacks them on their ass. They get defensive and then they kill stuff that you probably could have sold through had you like worked with them through the process.
Right. Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
My question is how do you deal with having a client who fundamentally doesn't like to address tension, and just like isn't interested in hearing about tension? That's just a problem that I consistently run into. I'm like, it can't always be sunny side of the street. Like, there has to be a problem to solve at some point.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it makes me wonder why an agency would even be hired by a client, because it just seems like you're pissing money away if like you don't want to try to solve a problem, right?
I believe I told them, I was like, well, if we just want to do this, we can just put the words across the screen for 30 seconds. That'll solve what you're trying to solve. I actually said that to a client last week.
Yeah, super constructive. Yeah. So I think like the way that I get around this, and this is just more about like client management than it is about any like secret strategy jujitsu or anything, but the storytelling frame really does work as far as being like, come on, like we we know how stories are supposed to go down, right? So one, you need to convince a brand that they are a story, right? Two, sometimes I have to convince clients that stories are important. But whenever I have to go through that process, and I know this is so dire, but like I do say this, I'm like, stories have driven so much crazy action throughout the history of mankind. It's why we act, right? So it's why because I'm from Wisconsin, I'll say it's like why Packers fans like put foam cheese on their head, right? As a fun example. But also, if you think about it, why do soldiers die? They die because they believe in a story about a country, right? And the soldiers that we are fighting against believe in the story of, let's go back to like World War II, believe in the story of Germany just as much as our soldiers believe in the story of the United States. And all they're fighting about is a story. Like, what is the better way to be, right? So I'll go down that wormhole when I'm trying to convince clients that stories are important. And I have a whole deck around that. And usually I can get them to be like, okay, got it. I understand why we have to like build this story. And then once I get them to understand why they have to build a story, then you say, okay, so what are the basic constructs of a story? Well, it has these elements and you have to have the tension or you have to have the problem. So sometimes with clients, I have to just walk them through it really slowly. But I think something also to perhaps think about with your clients, perhaps what they're going through is they're a little bit afraid of saying what they're weak about, and they're afraid it's all going to be doom and gloom. And I think one of the cool things about the 4C's is like, even in that Harley example, like, yeah, Harley, you kind of fucked up. Like you cause a massive like decline in the industry, but you're the leader of the pack. You're Harley. You're amazing. You have all this awesome stuff in your DNA. You have the tools to fix this. You just have to use different tools right now. And so sometimes I think clients get afraid because they think they're going to get whipped by us as advertisers, brand people, when actually we need to show them when we go through the tensions and the problems that there's hope in there and that they can be the hero.
Yeah, I've worked primarily in the athletic space, and one of the things we struggle with is the athletic ethos is really, we're worried about us. You know, it's always like scouting, and there's what's our, and I've had the good fortune of working with really old, super established brands. Heidi, you know what those are. But like the hardest thing is to get them to see the larger world outside of, because it's so much in your athletic psyche to worry about us or a singular opponent versus the larger scope and world. So getting the brand outside of the thing is like really hard to get buy-in from superiors, and because it goes so much in the face of everything you're kind of raised into, for lack of a better, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, it's true. It's true that the athletic clients can be a little tough in that. But I think one way to think about it is if there's something, usually if there's a data point where there's weakness, that gives you permission to have conversations that are beyond where they normally want to have the conversation. Because a weak data point like falling attendance or less people interacting with them will start to scare them because it's starting to threaten their business. And then you're allowed to like talk to them about like, well, let's talk about what's really going on, why this might be happening, right?
Yeah, that's the key point with sports, as with most clients. But if you start talking about money and the bottom line, like you get people's attention really quick. Like
absolutely.
Just kind of building up on that point, and similarly, I really like this storytelling methodology because like thinking about the traditional 4C's, and at least in my experience, I've worked with a lot of legacy brands and brands that have been in their spaces. Maybe they're category leaders, but there's a lot of proliferation of competition now in the category. And it's just about like staying ahead and keeping ahead before you become a Blockbuster or a Kodak. Right. So I really think this is interesting because I know I have a lot of conversations about like, what does legacy mean? Why does your brand have the right to be in a certain space or talk about a certain cultural moment? And they're just like, well, we've been there, like we're here, we're attached, we're endemic to this. And it's kind of like knowing that consumers are constantly entering and leaving your like target cohort. Like how do you keep them engaged and really like identify that purpose for them being there? So I really love that this like kind of puts the tension forward and positions them as a hero because one, every client likes to hear that, but also it really forces you to kind of define that purpose. I love like the idea of serving. So that's I think a really interesting use for like those heritage brands.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I would love to talk to you more offline about how you're navigating these heritage brands because they are some of the most difficult brands to work on right now.
Yeah.
So sending you lots of good strategy juju on that. And I'm glad that this could be helpful in doing
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah. Thank you.
One of the things I loved about the kind of updated storytelling framework is that it really gives each of the different pieces equal playing field. I think I've been in different environments where some agencies are really focused on a cultural insight and some might be really focused on the truth of the brand. And eventually when you kind of go through that magic conversion, you tend to lean towards one and then have the three kind of fold to support that. And I think this one kind of gives them a little bit more of a counterbalance. And if anything, maybe elevates the user a little bit more in a positive way and thinks about how the brand solves for them versus how the brand is always a solution. So I think it's really nice how it keeps it a little bit more even playing field when you need to synthesize.
That's awesome. Thank you. You know, that actually reminds me of something that had nothing to do with this deck, but it's something that I've preached a lot, is that a lot of times 4C's are out of balance, like where one of the C's is more dominant in the story just because there's a ton of pain in the category or something's really fucked up in culture or the company has a really strong point of view about what it does in the world. And I'm okay with them being out of balance because I think that's just life. But what I'm not okay with, building on something you were talking about, is I'm not okay with agencies being like, well, it's always about the cultural C or it's always about the client C, right? Like you don't know what the balance, you shouldn't go in with an idea of like, this is how the balance is going to work. You should let the balance reveal itself to you in your process.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So a lot of the campaigns that I work on auto, and a lot of the stuff I work on is very cyclical. Like, okay, we know we have another annual sales event coming up. And so we don't do a lot of this process unless there's something where we have new news. So I guess my first question is, would you say this is something you can use for something that's kind of like, you know, expected, that it's coming up every year and you don't necessarily have something new to say to kind of jazz it up a little? And then secondly, if so, to your point about like working with clients, if they're kind of expecting the same sort of thing and not to shake it up, how do you prepare them for that?
That's a good question. Well, it's interesting because whereas there's basics about the automobile industry that don't change, right? Like, you know, you're going to have this annual sale. Culture's changing. People are changing, right? And so I think there is a pretty constant and dynamic conversation going on right now in the world about what is our relationship to mobility? What is our relationship to money? Like right now, my boyfriend and I were just talking about this yesterday. We're like, man, who's going to buy a new car right now? You know, like, because of everything else. And so there, as much as like that whole like rhythm in that calendar stays steady, the world keeps moving around it. And so look, that's why I think the 4C's is a really cool way, even on a sale thing for an auto, because it forces you to step back and say like, where are we right now? And a lot of times when clients are struggling with that, with like, oh, just do the sale, like who cares, man, let's do the sale thing, right? Like that whole thing. A good exercise is to take a step back with clients and say, let's just talk about how the world has changed in general and for our people in the last year. Let's think about a year ago. Let's talk about what's going on a year ago. And sometimes I'll pull headlines and I'll pull like funny ones or I'll pull like serious ones. Like a year from now, I'll definitely be talking about Tiger King, right? Because like remember Tiger King, like, you know, like, and so like in a way, like pulling them back a year earlier to make them go through the process of like, yeah, actually things have changed. Maybe we should take a step back and look at this differently is a really powerful way of not only acknowledging and giving it fresh insight, but bringing your clients along on that journey.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can you do a sort of a category analysis? Because I've had to do a lot of competitive audits where just literally going through each of the brands that are direct competitors to you and just doing a thorough in-depth look at them. is there a difference in just looking at the category holistically, having to do a competitive audit?
That's a great question, Julian. Thank you for bringing that up. So I think the root of most category investigations is that just bang it out, competitive audit, right? Like I hardly ever do a category audit without that being the building block of it, and having like, you know, the 6 categories that you're looking at and all that stuff, all that shit, right? But then when I think of like a category C, that's where I'm starting to get into like, what are people's relationships with the category? What do they want? Like, what do I want out of a pen? I'm really picky about pens, so I can talk about pens forever, right? And that's like where more of the category thinking comes in, fueled by that competitive audit, but taking it one step further with the emotional relationship that I have with that category.
Sometimes you are prompted with an acquisition strategy, and so you are looking at consumers that don't have a prior relationship to a category. So in that case, how would you approach the category and cultural analysis?
It's well, I think the motorcycling example is a great example of that, because ridership is falling off, right? And so few people actually are picking it up. And so that spot is an acquisition spot, right? You're trying to find the emotional truth about the people that the category can answer. You're tapping into a latent attention that's inside of them, and they haven't considered that this could be a solution, but actually it could be an awesome solution to the tension that they're experiencing. You have to find the tension not with the category, but with somewhere else. Does that make sense? Did I articulate that the right way?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think that's a good answer, and also makes me think of the functional versus emotional point that I think Gregory brought up earlier. You could also look at people's behaviors and see which behavior is not being met by certain categories of products.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
That's great. You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, so that is a perfect dovetail into where I'm coming from, that we deal with the conflict of trying to create a strategy for a platform that needs to be all things to all people. And then not only that, but I'm having to push off the tension inside my company from being a sub-brand of a much larger, already deeply positioned brand. So, and to try to find the tension between those 2 points inside our team, as everyone has discussed here, is difficult. And I'm almost trying to seek the primitive tension, like inside our audiences, many audiences. And we look to other platform type companies, such as the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, to see how they deal with it. But I'm interested in finding out how we can narrow. It's so difficult to narrow down what it is that we do when you serve so many audiences. I guess it's such a large problem that Andrea was talking about, that we have difficulty as a creative, trying to find an edge, right, that I can grab, and something that is compelling and has that tension and doesn't dismiss audiences. So if you have any insight, I know that you've worked with platform type businesses before, but a lot of our leadership looks at us as being almost a utility, right? So it's very difficult to find the edge to a utility and make that a compelling story.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, one of my favorite examples of this was what Coca-Cola did. And I know this is such an old example, but it's so clean that I really enjoy this example. So a few years after 9/11, or maybe like a year after 9/11, Coca-Cola came out with the happiness campaign. Now, talk about like the biggest freaking umbrella in the world, right? Like happiness, you can't get a higher order brand thing than happiness, right? And Coca-Cola was also realizing that not Coca-Cola company, but actually Coke, the product, is a product that serves everyone. I mean, they really do. They serve everybody, right? And then they chose a platform of happiness, which is probably could be one of the most milquetoast platforms ever. But what they did was they really played upon the cultural tension that people were feeling at the time. And they understood, what was happening culturally that was freaking people out. And at the time, if you think of a post 9/11 world, much like where we are now, everyone was really scared. Everyone was really cautious of one another. We didn't know like what was going to happen in the world. It was a very uncertain time. And so the idea of happiness had a really great tension to play against, right? And so when we're dealing with these massive brands like Nike, like Coca-Cola, the question is, what is the world feeling? What is the world struggling with right now? And how can we help the world through that struggle moment and be relevant to them? So I would say Facebook has tried to do this with connection. I don't think Facebook has really invested in their brand enough that the brand has been successful in it. But you know, the whole idea of, I don't know what the line has been recently, but something around connecting people, connecting communities, that kind of thing, right? And they're trying to be for connection in a disconnected world. I think the issue with Facebook's stance is that they are driving the disconnection. So they're kind of fighting against themselves, right? But what Coca-Cola has done really brilliantly, and I think what Nike's done really brilliantly in being like for athleticism and for achievement, is that they are tapping into something primal, right? So if you look across every single culture, people experience happiness, right? In every single culture, people want to achieve. So that's great. And they're recognizing what's going on in the broader world that they can fight against in trying to do that. And that really comes from BBH style branding. BBH style is like every single brand that they do has a primal desire that it taps into. So when I worked on the Axe account at BBH, our primal desire was all around seduction. Because in every single culture, you could see the game of seduction playing out. And seduction has counterpoints. Rejection is the counterpoint to seduction. And that gave Axe, a global brand that talked to young men all over the world, teeth and a place to go, even though the umbrella was really broad. So look for the primal truth that you're trying to tap into. Look for the big cultural problem that you're trying to solve, and then unleash the brand on it.
That's a really good point. It's interesting that you say that, because I was the thing that keeps ringing through my mind is Oscar Wilde saying that where words stop, music starts. So that's like the idea of the or the sound of the universe that like transcends language. Like that's what we're offering.
Yeah. Yeah. And what is that thing? The question I always asked myself when I was at BBH, and I ask myself over and over again on every brand I work on, is what is that thing that I can find in every single culture? So whether it's seduction, happiness, achievement. When I was working on Google, it was about progress, right? You can find the story of that across every audience, across every culture.